There's a quiet power in words hidden, often overlooked, until the moment they change everything. Picture this: a dimly lit chamber in a medieval castle where a lone scribe dips his quill into ink, not knowing his words will alter the destiny of kings. This isn't just a story about parchment and politics. It's about how a single manuscript, crafted in shadow, became the silent architect of a dynasty's future. Succession wasn't always decided by birthright or battle. Sometimes it was written into existence by a ghostwriter's hand, a figure lost to history, but whose influence echoes through the centuries. What if I told you that one of the most pivotal moments in medieval history hinged not on a sword's edge, but on the careful strokes of a pen? The document we're about to explore didn't just record history, it made it. Buried beneath layers of time and intrigue, this manuscript held secrets so explosive they could topple thrones and rewrite legacies. Who was the scribe behind these fateful words? Why did they risk everything to craft them? And how did a text meant to remain unseen become the key to a kingdom's survival? The answers lie in a tale of ambition, deception, and the startling truth that even the mightiest rulers could be outmaneuvered by ink. This is the story of when a ghostwriter changed a dynasty, a revelation that challenges everything we think we know about power in the Middle Ages. It's a reminder that history isn't just written by the winners, it's also shaped by the unseen hands who dared to whisper in their ears. By the time we're done, you'll see how a single page could carry the weight of a crown, and why, even today, words remain the most dangerous weapons of all. So lean in close, the past is about to speak. The identity of this ghostwriter is one of history's most tantalizing mysteries, a puzzle with missing pieces, where every clue only deepens the intrigue. Imagine a figure moving through the shadows of medieval courts, their face hidden, their quill dipped not just in ink but in calculated intention. They weren't some ordinary scribe copying decrees. This was a mind sharp enough to weave words into weapons, to draft a future where kings would unknowingly act as pawns in their design. Clues scattered across crumbling chronicles hint at who they might have been. Some whisper of a disgraced scholar cast out from the university for ideas too dangerous to tolerate. Others suggest an exiled noble stripped of titles and lands, turning parchment into their revenge. Then there's the theory of the monk, a man of God with a grievance against the crown, writing not for glory but to correct what he saw as divine injustice. One contemporary account describes encountering a stranger in a cloister, their voice barely audible like whispers in the cathedral, yet their words carried the weight of prophecy. Whoever they were, their anonymity was no accident. It was armor, but why take such risks? The motives behind the manuscript are as debated as the writer's name. Revenge seems obvious: the exiled noble, the wronged scholar, the disillusioned monk, each with scores to settle. Yet the text itself suggests something more layered. Passages brim with arguments so meticulously crafted, so dripping with legal and theological precision, that they couldn't have been born of spite alone. Was this ghostwriter an idealist, convinced their words could steer a kingdom toward justice? Or was it sheer ambition, the thrill of pulling strings from the dark? What's undeniable is the irony. A person erased from history became one of its quietest architects. Their name may be lost, but their influence lingers in every line of that manuscript, in every royal decree it shaped. It's a reminder that power isn't always seized with a sword. Sometimes it's smuggled into history on the back of a page, written by a hand the world never knew to thank. The kingdom was unraveling at the seams, a once mighty dynasty reduced to whispers in candlelit corridors and knives hidden in silk gloves. Every noble family smelled blood in the water, maneuvering their own candidates for the throne like pieces on a chessboard. The old king, once a lion in his youth, now sat hollow-eyed on his throne, paralyzed by grief after losing 3 heirs in as many years. One fell from a horse under strange circumstances, another succumbed to a fever that struck no one else in the castle, and the last simply vanished during a hunt, leaving only a blood-stained cloak tangled in the brambles. With no clear successor, the court fractured into warring camps. The northern lords pushed for a distant cousin with ties to their coal-rich lands. The southern bishops backed a pious but inexperienced nephew, while the king's own counselors, supposedly his most trusted advisors, secretly auctioned their influence to the highest bidder. Meanwhile, beyond the borders, rival kingdoms sharpened their swords, drafting treaties that carved up the realm like a feast for vultures. It wasn't just a crisis of leadership, it was a countdown to collapse. This was the tinderbox the ghostwriter walked into. Where others saw chaos, they saw opportunity, a chance to rewrite the rules while the kingdom gasped for direction. Their genius wasn't just in crafting words, but in timing. They waited until the very moment the king, drowning in despair, demanded a solution from his squabbling council. That's when the manuscript appeared, not in the hands of a shouting lord or a scheming bishop, but slipped quietly onto the royal scribe's desk, as if it had always belonged there. The text's brilliance lay in its illusions. It didn't scream revolution, it whispered inevitability. Page after page wove together ancient laws, religious doctrine, and precedents from forgotten chronicles to present a single, startling argument. The crown shouldn't pass to the strongest noble or the richest ally, but to the most capable mind, specifically a forgotten fourth cousin, a bookish young man exiled to a monastery years earlier. The document framed this not as a power grab, but as divine providence, the kingdom's last hope for stability. Of course, the ghostwriter knew what they were doing. That obscure cousin had one quality the others lacked: malleability. Untested, unconnected, and desperate for legitimacy, he'd be indebted to whoever engineered his rise. And so, with the precision of a surgeon, the manuscript didn't just suggest a new king, it scripted an entire reign, down to the advisors he should appoint conveniently, men with ties to the ghostwriter's shadowy network. The dynasty's weakness became the parchment's strength. Desperation, after all, makes even kings believe in miracles. The manuscript wasn't just ink on parchment, it was a spider's web, each strand carefully placed to ensnare its readers. At first glance, it appeared scholarly, even dull, filled with the dense language of legal codes and religious texts. But beneath that veneer of respectability lay something far more dangerous, a weapon disguised as a document. Every section, every carefully chosen phrase, served a dual purpose: to persuade and to unsettle. Take the infamous passage declaring, "A crown unearned is a crown cursed." On the surface, it echoed medieval notions of divine justice. But in context, it was a direct attack on the leading heir's claim, implying his rise would bring God's wrath upon the kingdom. The genius, it never named him outright, letting the reader's own suspicions do the work. Then came the legal sleight of hand. The ghostwriter dredged up ancient laws, half-forgotten edicts from centuries past, to argue that bloodline succession wasn't just flawed, it was optional. One particularly cunning section cited a precedent where a king's bastard son, by virtue of wit and virtue alone, had been granted legitimacy by a council of bishops. The message was clear: tradition could be bent if the right hands held the parchment, but the masterstroke lay in the prophecy. Tucked between dry citations of canon law was a chilling prediction. The dynasty would fall unless the scepter passed to the branch long pruned. No such prophecy existed in any known text before this moment. It was pure invention, yet presented with such conviction that even skeptical courtiers hesitated. The ghostwriter understood something timeless. People fear chaos more than they love truth. What made the manuscript truly sinister, though, wasn't its individual arguments, but how they reinforced one another. Scripture justified the law validated the prophecy, and the prophecy made disobedience seem like treason against heaven itself. It created a closed loop of persuasion, leaving no room for dissent. Even the physical presentation played a role. The ink bore a faint scent of myrrh, subtly evoking sacred texts, while the parchment's edges were gilt with gold leaf, mimicking royal decrees. Every detail whispered authority, making rebellion feel not just unwise but unthinkable. And here's the cruelest twist: the ghostwriter's lies contained just enough truth to stick. The rival branch they championed did have a distant claim, buried under layers of genealogy. The cursed crown rhetoric tapped into genuine anxieties about the heir's rumored incompetence. Even the fabricated prophecy echoed real folk tales from the kingdom's hinterlands. The manuscript didn't create fears, it weaponized ones already there. That's why it worked. You can't unsee what you have believed all along. The distribution of the manuscript wasn't just clever, it was a masterclass in medieval misinformation. Imagine a single drop of ink spreading through water, staining everything it touches without revealing its source. That's precisely how this dangerous text permeated the kingdom. Copies didn't appear one by one, they materialized everywhere at once, as if the very air had whispered its contents. Monasteries woke to find it tucked between the pages of their most sacred psalters. Noble courts discovered it slipped into diplomatic correspondence disguised as routine edicts. Even the papal chambers weren't spared. A cardinal reportedly found a copy sewn into the lining of his ceremonial robe, placed there by hands he'd never traced. The ghostwriter's network operated like shadows at dusk, present but impossible to grasp. Some scribes later confessed to receiving gold coins from hooded strangers, their faces obscured by pilgrims' cloaks, with orders to copy the text for the salvation of the realm. Others claimed the manuscript simply appeared on their desks overnight, as though delivered by spirits. But the real stroke of genius, the deliberate use of intermediaries who didn't even know they were pawns. Traveling minstrels, those purveyors of gossip and song, were handed verses to memorize harmless-sounding couplets that, when pieced together, revealed entire sections of the text. Peasants humming these tunes in taverns unwittingly became messengers, spreading sedition through melody. And then there were the forgeries. Dozens of variations circulated, some subtly altered to appeal to specific audiences. Bishops received copies heavy with scriptural references, while military commanders found versions emphasizing the warrior virtues of the proposed new king. This wasn't just about spreading ideas, it was about making each reader feel the text spoke directly to them, as if divinely inspired. By the time the king's spies realized what was happening, the manuscript had already taken root in too many minds to eradicate. Burn one copy and 10 more surfaced, arrest a scribe and the minstrels kept singing. The ghostwriter's greatest trick was turning secrecy into spectacle. They didn't just want the text read, they wanted it debated in hushed tones at feasts, analyzed by scholars in cloisters, and brandished by nobles as proof of their political acumen. By the time the king's chancellor stood to denounce it as treason, half the court had already memorized passages. That's the power of a well-timed whisper. By the time authority thinks to silence it, the echo has already become a roar. The crown prince's first reaction was laughter, a sharp, dismissive bark that echoed through the throne room as he tossed the manuscript onto a pile of petitions. Mad scribbling, he called it, the work of some bitter cleric with too much time and too little sense. But laughter fades, and in the silence that followed, the words began their slow, insidious work. Like water seeping into cracks, they spread where he couldn't see, first among his servants, who stole glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking, then among his knights, whose once unshakable loyalty now carried a hesitance when they bowed. Even his own mother, the Dowager Queen, was seen clutching rosary beads tighter after audiences, as if praying against some unseen threat. The manuscript didn't just attack his claim, it dismantled his reality. Every flaw it named, his temper, his indecision, the way his hands shook during council meetings, were truths he'd spent years disguising. Now they were laid bare, not as passing weaknesses but as signs of divine disfavor. A king who trembles invites the realm to tremble with him, one passage hissed. Another, more damning still, cited an old prophecy about the stag with broken antlers, a ruler whose reign would end in famine and fire. The prince had heard that phrase before, muttered by peasants during a failed hunt. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidence doesn't haunt you at midnight when the candles gutter and the portraits of your ancestors seem to glare. Art from that period tells its own story. In one famous miniature, the prince stands gripping the manuscript so tightly his knuckles bleed white, while his advisors shrink back, their faces a mix of pity and dread. The artist captured something the chronicles couldn't, the way paranoia twists a man's posture, how his shoulders hunch as if expecting a blade between them. Worse yet were the rumors that followed him like shadows. A stable boy swore he heard the prince screaming at an empty chapel, demanding the saint's answer whether he was cursed. A laundress found his bed linens tangled and sweat-soaked night after night. The manuscript had become a mirror, and what stared back terrified him. His downfall wasn't sudden, it was a slow unraveling. He began cancelling audiences, convinced every petitioner carried a hidden copy of the text. He ordered arrests without evidence, turning allies into enemies with each impulsive decree. By the time he tried burning every manuscript he could find, it was too late. The words had already escaped the page, living in the whispers of his court. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter, his own confessor, who knelt before the council and testified that the prince, in a moment of anguish, had begged for absolution in case the prophecy is true. That admission, more than any battlefield defeat, sealed his fate. A king who doubts his own right to rule is a king already fallen, and here's the cruelest irony. The ghostwriter never needed the prince to believe the manuscript. They only needed everyone else to, because in the end, legitimacy isn't about bloodlines or crowns, it's about the stories people tell when you leave the room. The prince didn't lose his throne because the words were true. He lost because he let them become truth. The church's sudden embrace of the manuscript wasn't just opportunistic, it was a calculated masterpiece of medieval realpolitik. For weeks, bishops had watched the text spread like wildfire through their dioceses, their silence not born of ignorance but of careful observation. They recognized its power long before the crown did, and then, on the feast day of St. Michael, a deliberate choice, invoking the archangel who cast down the prideful, the archbishop stood before a packed cathedral and did the unthinkable. He held up the manuscript, its pages catching the stained glass light, and declared it a revelation for troubled times. Overnight, what had been treason became scripture. What made the church's endorsement so devastating was its timing. The ghostwriter had laced the text with just enough theological nuance to make opposition seem like heresy. One passage cleverly referenced St. Augustine's teachings on just rulership, while another twisted a parable about vineyard keepers into a warning against unfit heirs. These weren't random citations, they were traps. Any bishop who denounced the manuscript risked contradicting canonized saints. Even the Pope, when pressed, could only offer vague admonitions about discernment, his usual thunder stolen by the sheer craft of the text's arguments. But let's not mistake this for piety. The Church had skin in the game. For years, the Crown had been encroaching on ecclesiastical lands, taxing monasteries, and appointing pliant bishops. The manuscript's proposal, a devout, cloister-raised king, was a gift wrapped in scripture. Suddenly, priests who'd never dared question royal authority found their spines, preaching sermons that framed succession as a soul's duty. To obey an unworthy king is to defy God, one fiery friar proclaimed, his words copied and distributed by the ghostwriters' network. The genius lay in the illusion of consensus. By the time the king's men stormed the first printing house, entire monasteries were illuminating copies like sacred texts. The manuscript's margins now boasted elaborate illustrations of angels delivering scrolls to monks, a visual echo of divine revelation. And here's the twist: the ghostwriter had anticipated this too. Early drafts included blank spaces perfect for such embellishments, as if inviting the Church to claim ownership. Nothing legitimizes like gold leaf and Latin chant. Yet the real coup was how the manuscript turned the Church's own tools against it. For centuries, clergy had used discovered relics and visions to sway the masses. Now they found themselves outmaneuvered by a text that played their game better than they did. When a cardinal tried to denounce it as fabrication, a lowly deacon, likely another ghostwriter's pawn, stood in open council and read aloud a passage predicting such false shepherds. The room fell silent. Even the most cynical bishop understood this wasn't just a document. It was a mirror reflecting back whatever the viewer feared or desired most, and in that reflection, the old order crumbled. The distant cousin wasn't just plucked from obscurity. He was sculpted by the manuscript's words, each line chiseling him into the ruler the kingdom never knew it needed. Imagine a man who'd spent his days copying psalms in a drafty monastery, his royal blood so diluted even the court genealogists had to squint at the records. Yet within months of the text circulation, peasants spoke his name with reverence, and nobles who once scoffed now competed to host him in their halls. The ghostwriter hadn't just promoted him, they'd rewritten his entire existence. Where chronicles once dismissed his lineage as feeble and forgotten, the manuscript spun it as divine discretion. God had hidden his true heir like a pearl in mud, waiting for the moment of revelation. His transformation was a performance worthy of the finest playwright. Every gesture, every public appearance seemed lifted straight from the manuscript's pages. When he distributed alms to the poor, he did so at the exact hour the text described as the saint's favored time. His choice of bride, a minor noblewoman known for her charity work, mirrored the document's passage on a queen who kneels beside her people. Even his new motto, "By grace, not blood," was verbatim from the ghostwriter's most quoted section. Some historians argue this proves collusion, that the cousin must have been handpicked and coached. Others insist he was simply shrewd enough to recognize the script of his own salvation and follow it to the letter. What's undeniable is how thoroughly the manuscript reshaped perception. Artists began depicting him with a faint golden halo in illuminations, though no one could recall who first suggested it. Minstrels sang of a childhood miracle where he'd healed a sick falcon, a tale conspicuously absent from earlier records. The ghostwriter understood something primal about power. Legitimacy isn't inherited. It's conjured through stories repeated often enough to become memory. By the time the cousin reached the capital, crowds wept at the sight of him, not because they knew him, but because they'd been taught to recognize him as the answer to their prayers. Yet the most brilliant twist was how the manuscript insulated him from failure. Every stumble became proof of his humanity, every triumph evidence of divine favor. When an early harvest failed under his provisional rule, the text's defenders pointed to a passage warning the land will groan before it blooms. When he tripped during his coronation procession, bishops declared it a sign he stoopeth to lift the lowly. The ghostwriter had built him a narrative so resilient, even his flaws burnished his legend. Whether puppet or partner, the cousin played his role to perfection. His first decree as king, a royal commission to preserve the manuscript in gold and vellum, enshrining the very words that made him. The ultimate irony, in embracing the ghostwriter's fiction, he made it history. Centuries later, scholars would debate whether the text revealed destiny or invented it. But by then, the ink had long since dried and the throne stood firm. Some lies, it seems, become truth simply by lasting. The manuscript didn't just whisper to nobles in their gilded halls, it roared through peasant huts and market squares, turning apathy into outrage. For generations, commoners had shrugged at succession squabbles, their lives unchanged whether a king's name was Edward or Henry. But this text, translated into the rough, earthy language of the fields, did something revolutionary. It made the throne's chaos personal. Your empty bellies, one passage thundered, are not God's will, but the fruit of a rotten branch on the royal tree. Suddenly, every failed harvest, every unjust tax, became proof of the old heir's divine disfavor. Balladmongers, those sly puppeteers of public sentiment, seized the narrative. A once obscure folk tune about a hungry winter was rewritten with new verses naming the prince directly, his imagined crimes growing taller with each retelling. By the time the song reached the capital, it accused him of everything from hoarding grain to poisoning wells. The genius wasn't in the lies, but in the grain of truth they clung to. The prince had indeed raised taxes to fund his falconry obsession. The ghostwriter magnified that single misstep into a tapestry of tyranny, knowing peasants would stitch their own grievances into its threads. But the real masterstroke was how the manuscript flipped the script on loyalty. Traditionally, commoners were taught to see kings as distant, almost celestial figures, their right to rule as unchallengeable as sunrise. This text shattered that illusion, arguing that a king who failed his people broke heaven's covenant first. When the shepherd starves his flock, it declared, the lambs must choose another. That phrase, simple enough for a milkmaid to repeat yet explosive in its implications, spread like fever. For the first time, succession wasn't just about bloodlines, it was about bread. And then came the symbols, crude but effective. The rival claimant's sigil, once unknown, began appearing chalked on tavern doors and carved into market stalls. Someone, likely the ghostwriter's agents, started distributing cheap woodcuts showing the old heir as a gluttonous wolf, while the monastery-raised cousin was depicted as a humble shepherd. These images needed no literacy to understand, and they transformed abstract political theory into something visceral. A loaf of bread left at a shrine became not just charity, but a silent protest. A child's rhyme about the wolf's fall sung at dusk turned into a dare. What made this populist wave unstoppable was its spontaneity. The ghostwriter hadn't orchestrated every tavern argument or roadside sermon. They'd simply given people permission to voice what they'd long felt. When royal messengers tried burning copies of the ballads, villagers memorized the verses instead. When a bailiff arrested a cobbler for scrawling the new king's initials on his door, 50 more appeared by dawn. The manuscript's true power lay in this alchemy. It turned whispers into a chorus so loud, even the stone walls of the palace couldn't muffle it. By the time the old regime realized their subjects had become jurors in their own trial, the verdict was already in. The lesson etched into those inked pages was timeless. Power doesn't reside in crowns or decrees, but in the stories people tell about them. And in that game, a well-placed word could outmaneuver an army. The ghostwriter hadn't just changed a succession, they'd exposed the brittle illusion that kings rule by anything but consent. And once that truth took root, no force in the realm could rip it out. The king's signature didn't just mark parchment, it marked the moment a centuries-old order crumbled. Witnesses described how his hand shook as the quill scratched the decree, the same hand that had once swung a sword in battle, now trembling under the weight of ink. The chamber fell so silent, they swore later they could hear the candle wax drip. Every word of that document mirrored the manuscript's language with eerie precision, as if the ghostwriter's quill had guided the king's own. By the consent of heaven and the will of the realm, it began a phrase lifted straight from the text, turning rebellion into sacrament. What happened in those final hours behind closed doors remains one of history's great silences. The court physician's journals hint at a ruler broken by more than illness, scribbling about fits of agitation and ravings over cursed pages. One servant swore he saw the king hurl a copy of the manuscript into the fire, only to retrieve it scorched moments later, clutching it to his chest like a child with a nightmare. Yet the official chronicles tell a different tale of a sovereign making a sober, statesmanlike choice for his people's good. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a man outmaneuvered by forces he couldn't fight, not on battlements but in the minds of his subjects. The disinherited prince's fate was sealed with chilling efficiency. Stripped of titles before the ink dried, he was banished to a coastal fortress under guard, not as a prisoner, they claimed, but for his own protection. A generous pension was granted, along with a library of pious texts, as if to rebuke the very worldliness the manuscript had accused him of. His supporters melted away like morning frost, some swearing newfound loyalty to the cousin, others simply vanishing into the countryside. The speed of their betrayal revealed the ghostwriter's deepest insight. Loyalty follows perceived power, not the other way around. Yet the real masterpiece was how thoroughly the narrative absorbed dissent. When a handful of die-hard lords protested, their objections were framed not as principled resistance, but as proof of the manuscript's warnings about those who cling to corruption. The cousin's coronation, once unthinkable, became inevitable not through force, but through sheer exhaustion, the collective sigh of a too weary to fight the tide. Even the prince's mother, the iron-willed dowager queen, was seen kneeling at the new king's first mass, her stiff back the only hint of defiance. The ghostwriter's fingerprints were everywhere in the aftermath. The counselors who'd opposed the manuscript found themselves dismissed or reassigned to distant posts, replaced by men whose names had appeared in its pages as wise counselors. Taxes were lowered just enough to validate claims of the new reign's blessedness, while the harvest that year, by pure chance, was the richest. Memory a sign, the bishops proclaimed, of heaven's favor. Every coincidence was curated into proof, every stumble of the old regime recast as predestined failure. And then the final stroke. The manuscript itself was enshrined in the royal archives, not as a controversial text, but as a sacred artifact of the transition. Scribes were ordered to copy it into the official chronicles, blending its words seamlessly with centuries of law. Within a generation, schoolchildren would recite its passages as historical fact, unaware that these eternal truths had been crafted by an unseen hand in a single, calculated act of reinvention. The ultimate power isn't just to change the future, it's to rewrite the past so thoroughly that no one remembers it was ever different. The coronation should have been the ghostwriter's triumph, their words finally spoken aloud in the sacred hush of the cathedral, their vision made flesh in the kneeling of kings. Yet as the rival claimant placed his hands on the relic-covered Bible, no manuscript lay open beside it, no scribe stepped forward to read its passages. The text that had shattered a dynasty was nowhere to be seen, and that was the most cunning trick of all. Every ritual that day breathed the ghostwriter's logic while pretending it had always existed. When the new king swore to rule by wisdom, not by birth, the crowd murmured approval as if this were some age-old vow, not a phrase, lifted verbatim from page 32 of the banned document. The Archbishop's sermon on shepherd kings echoed whole paragraphs of the text, yet he delivered them with the gravitas of quoting scripture. Even the crown itself, redesigned with monastic symbols the manuscript had praised, was presented as a rediscovery of ancient tradition. The coronation wasn't just a ceremony, it was an act of collective amnesia where radical reinvention masqueraded. Restoration, historians would later call this the Coronation Paradox. The more thoroughly the ghostwriter's ideas won, the less they could be acknowledged. To cite the manuscript openly would admit the throne's legitimacy sprang from a seditious text, not divine right. So the court performed an elaborate pantomime, pretending every innovation was actually a return to purer roots. Forgotten charters were found in monastery vaults, conveniently mirroring the ghostwriter's arguments. Half-remembered prophecies were reinterpreted to fit the new narrative. Even the king's coronation robes, woven with imagery of pruning shears and fresh shoots, visualized the manuscript's rotten branch metaphor while claiming inspiration from tapestries long overlooked. But the true brilliance lay in what wasn't said. When the disgraced prince's name surfaced in the prayers for all who have strayed, no one mentioned his forced abdication. When nobles who'd opposed the new king kissed his ring, no record noted their sudden reversals. The ghostwriter understood that power isn't just about controlling the story, it's about controlling the silence between the words. Their manuscript had become like the cathedral's own foundations, essential, invisible, and never discussed. And so the unlikeliest of kings was crowned not by rejecting tradition, but by weaponizing it. Every ancient custom invoked that day was less than a year old, crafted in the same shadowy scriptorium as the manuscript itself. The nobles who cheered loudest knew this, just as they knew their own newfound loyalty was less about belief than survival. Yet in the end, it didn't matter. The ghostwriter's victory wasn't in being remembered, it was in making their fiction so seamless, so unremarkable, that it became truth by default. By the time the choir sang the final hymn, even those who'd plotted the old king's fall half-believed they were witnessing not a revolution, but a homecoming. The archives didn't just change, they vanished, not with the dramatic crackle of burning parchment, but with the quiet precision of a knife scraping vellum clean. Scribes worked by lamplight, their hands steady as they erased entire generations from family trees, stitching the new king's lineage seamlessly into the royal tapestry. Portraits of the disinherited prince weren't destroyed that would have raised inconvenient questions. Instead, his face was painted over with some forgotten cousin's features, his heraldic colors altered just enough to confuse future historians. Even the prince's infamous temper, once the subject of court gossip, was retroactively assigned to an uncle who died decades earlier. The past became clay, reshaped to fit the ghostwriter's mold. What made this historical airbrushing so insidious was its subtlety. Unlike crude propaganda, which shouts its lies, this revision whispered. A chronicle from that era might mention the prince's illness as the reason for his abdication, leaving out the armed guards at his chamber door. Genealogies suddenly listed the new king's monastic years as a royal pilgrimage, framing his exile as spiritual preparation. Even the weather records were doctored. The harsh winter during the transition became a cleansing frost, as if nature itself endorsed the regime change. The ghostwriter understood that the most convincing fictions are those that leave room for the audience's imagination to fill in the gaps. But the real masterpiece was how they co-opted the opposition. Scholars who'd once defended the old heir found their own writings updated posthumously, their ink fading where it contradicted the new narrative, a famous poet's ode to the prince's valor. rediscovered with a crucial line changed now praising his wisdom in stepping aside. The bishop who'd initially denounced the manuscript, his sermons were selectively copied, leaving out his objections while preserving his later, more ambiguous statements. By the time the next generation of historians began their work, there was no coherent counter-narrative left to challenge. The dissenters hadn't been silenced, they'd been edited into complicity. Today, archivists sometimes find traces of the truth, a palimpsest where old ink bleeds through, a diary entry slipped between the pages of an official record. One particularly damning discovery came centuries later. A merchant's ledger noting the sudden purchase of 3 barrels of whitening by the royal scriptorium in the exact month the chronicles were being revised. But these fragments are outliers, curiosities dismissed as scribble errors or forgeries. After all, how could so many meticulous records be wrong? That's the genius of rewriting history. It doesn't just alter the past, it makes doubting the alteration seem like madness. The ghostwriter's ultimate victory wasn't in controlling what people believed, but in making their version the only one that could be believed. Walk into any library now, and you'll find no mention of the manuscript's role in the succession. The crisis it documented, the prophecies it invented, even its own existence all folded smoothly into the official story, like seams in a tailor's finest work. The lesson echoes through the ages. Power isn't just about writing history. It's about ensuring no one remembers there was ever another version to read. The ghostwriter's vanishing was as calculated as their words. One morning, the scribe who'd once bent over parchment in the castle's dimmest corner simply wasn't there. No farewell, no final decree, just an empty desk and an inkwell gone dry. Rumors sprouted like weeds in the cracks of the cobblestones. A guardsman swore he'd seen a hooded figure boarding a ship bound for Alexandria, a sack of books slung over one shoulder. The king's spymaster, meanwhile, circulated whispers of a shallow grave dug beyond the city walls, the body weighted down with the very coins paid for silence. But the most persistent tale, the one that curled like smoke through taverns and guild halls, claimed the ghostwriter never left at all, that they walked the palace corridors still, disguised as a minor functionary, their quill now drafting the very laws their manuscript had made possible. What makes the disappearance so haunting isn't the mystery, but the precision of it. Every potential clue feels planted. Every scrap of evidence a deliberate breadcrumb leading nowhere. A merchant's ledger from that year lists the purchase of one scholar's robe, black as midnight, paid for from the royal purse, yet no record exists of who wore it. A letter surfaced decades later, its elegant script matching the manuscript's hand, boasting of watching the coronation from the crowd like a gardener admiring blooms he planted. But when archivists traced the wax seal, it led to a noble house that had burned to the ground in the intervening years. The ghostwriter didn't just erase their tracks, they salted the earth behind them, and perhaps that was the final masterstroke. By refusing to claim credit, they ensured their work would outlive them. Had they stepped forward, they'd have become a target, a scapegoat for every discontent, a name to blame when harvests failed or wars were lost. Instead, they let their words become something greater than authorship. They became inevitability. When later kings cited ancient precedent for their reforms, they were unknowingly quoting the manuscript. When bishops preached of the shepherd king's sacred duty, they echoed phrases penned in shadow. The ghostwriter's genius was in understanding that the most enduring power isn't wielded, it's inherited, whispered from one generation to the next until its origins are forgotten. Even the new king, beneficiary of this silent coup, seemed to sense the specter at his shoulder. Chronicles note how he'd pause mid-sentence during council meetings, as if waiting for some unseen advisor's nod. He commissioned a stained glass window depicting Saint Jerome translating scripture, an odd choice for a warrior king, unless one recalls the manuscript's comparison of good rulership to careful translation of divine will. And when his own son came of age, the king presented him not with a sword, but with a lavishly bound copy of the kingdom's laws, their margins filled with annotations in familiar, spidery hand. The true legacy of that vanished scribe isn't in the kings who followed, but in the unspoken rule they established, that legitimacy could be crafted, that crowns could be won with parchment instead of blood. Every succession crisis since has played out not just on battlefields, but in scribbled chambers and sermon texts, in the stories told to justify power. The ghostwriter proved that history isn't just written by the victors, it's written by whoever holds the pen while the victors aren't looking. And that lesson, more than any single throne, was their gift to the ages. The manuscript's brilliance wasn't in being the first to twist truth, it was in perfecting the art. Medieval courts had always dripped with propaganda, from bribes tucked into bishops' sleeves to strategic marriages brokered like cattle trades. But where others relied on gold or bloodlines, this ghostwriter understood something far more potent. The right story, told relentlessly, could rewrite reality itself. They didn't invent the tools of persuasion, they sharpened them into scalpels. Take cherry-picking precedents, a tactic as old as law. Previous regimes had cited favorable edicts, but the manuscript wove scattered rulings into a tapestry so seamless, it made the unprecedented feel inevitable. A minor tax exemption from 2 centuries prior became proof of ancient rights, while inconvenient decrees were dismissed as corruptions of the age. Sound familiar? Modern lobbyists still play this game, dusting off obscure statutes to justify new agendas. Then there was the moral high ground, a weapon the ghostwriter wielded with chilling precision. While rivals grubbed for power through brute force, the manuscript framed its candidates' rise as a spiritual awakening. Every political demand was cloaked in scripture, every opponent's resistance painted as sin. A lord opposing the new succession wasn't just ambitious, he was defying God's ordained order. This wasn't persuasion, it was psychological siege warfare, collapsing dissent under the weight of its own alleged immorality. Today's activists and advertisers use the same playbook, wrapping policies in buzzwords like justice or freedom until disagreement feels like heresy. But the ghostwriter's most devastating innovation was turning enemies against themselves. The manuscript didn't just attack the prince, it reprogrammed his instincts. By spotlighting his temper, it guaranteed he'd lash out, proving its claims. By dubbing him cursed, it made every misfortune seem like confirmation. This wasn't criticism, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, engineered so the prince's every move tightened the noose. Modern gaslighting pales in comparison. Imagine a political ad so potent, it doesn't just smear a rival, it compels them to unravel on camera. What separates this text from crude medieval pamphlets is its surgical subtlety. It didn't scream lies, it whispered half-truths, letting listeners connect the dots. When it cited the rotten branch metaphor, nobles recalled the prince's actual blunders, while peasants thought of failed harvests. Both heard validation, neither realizing they'd been handed a script. Contemporary echo chambers operate the same way, feeding audiences just enough reality to make the fabrication digestible. The ghostwriter's true legacy isn't in the throne they toppled, but in the blueprint they left. Every spin doctor crafting a narrative, every influencer curating their persona, every regime rebranding oppression as patriotic duty, they're all heirs to that shadowy scribe. Because power doesn't just belong to those who hold the sword or the purse, it belongs to those who hold the pen and know how to make the world believe its ink is truth. The manuscript's physical fate is a paradox wrapped in ashes. The very document that reshaped a dynasty likely met its end in flames, not by accident but by design. Once the new king's legitimacy was cemented, the text became too dangerous to preserve. Why keep a blueprint for rebellion lying around? Court records from the era mention a great burning in the royal scriptorium, where seditious writings were reduced to smoke. But here's the twist: the fire wasn't an act of censorship. It was the ghostwriter's final stroke of genius. By destroying the original, they ensured no one could ever prove how much of it was invention. The myth would outlive the parchment. Surviving copies didn't escape unscathed. Scribes meticulously edited them, sanding down the sharpest edges until the text read like dull legal commentary. Passages about cursed crowns became generic warnings against pride. The fabricated prophecy was rebranded as an allegory for virtuous rule. Even the ink was tampered with. Chemical analysis of one 15th century copy reveals traces of vinegar, a common trick to age fresh writing. The manuscript's teeth had been pulled, its bite reduced to a whisper. These sanitized versions circulated in royal libraries, stripped of their power to inspire new uprisings. They weren't banned, they were defanged. Then came the 19th century tease. In 1843, a French antiquarian boasted of acquiring the Unaltered Succession manuscript from a Moldavian monastery. His letters describe marginal notes in a second hand, likely the ghostwriter's own, that called the prince a man more sinned against than sinning, a shocking departure from the public narrative. But when scholars rushed to examine it, the text had vanished. The antiquarian blamed a burglary. His housekeeper swore she'd seen him sell it to a man in a carriage bearing a noble family's crest. Either way, the trail went cold. For a brief moment, history had blinked open its eyes only to shut them again. Today, the hunt continues in hushed tones among collectors and historians. Some believe the intact manuscript lies in a vault beneath a Scottish castle, purchased by a Victorian industrialist obsessed with medieval intrigue. Others insist it's hidden in plain sight, rebound as an unremarkable chapter in some forgotten ecclesiastical compendium. But perhaps its true power was never in the parchment at all. The ghostwriter understood that ideas outlast their containers. The manuscript didn't need to survive. It had already seeped into the groundwater of history, its words echoing in every coronation oath, every whispered challenge to hereditary rule. The original may be dust, but its shadow still stretches across centuries, waiting for the right reader to wake it. Scholars who study the manuscript don't just read it, they dissect it like forensic linguists poring over a ransom note. Every syllable carries fingerprints. The rhythm alone betrays its creator, the measured cadence of someone schooled in classical rhetoric, the kind of mind that could quote Cicero by heart but twist his words like wire. Then there's the vocabulary flashes of monastic Latin sandwiched between vernacular punch, as if the writer moved seamlessly between cloister and tavern. But the real revelations lurk in the metaphors. Take the infamous gardener parable, where a ruler is likened to a man who prunes his own roses though it pains him. At face value, it's a pious lesson on tough choices. But read closer and the thorns show. The gardener doesn't hesitate. He doesn't mourn the fallen blooms. He cuts with a steady hand and dry eyes, justifying each snip as nature's will. That's not advice, it's a confession. The ghostwriter wasn't just describing power, they were admitting how they wielded it. The manuscript structure is another tell. Most political tracts of the era build toward crescendos, stacking arguments like siege towers. This one circles. Key points resurface like motifs in a fugue, each recurrence adding another layer of menace. The rotten branch metaphor first appears as a passing analogy, then returns as a legal precedent, and finally morphs into a divine warning. By the third iteration, even skeptical readers start glancing at the prince like he's already blighted. Modern psychologists call this the illusion of truth effect. Repeat something enough, and the brain mistakes familiarity for fact. The ghostwriter didn't just know this, they orchestrated it, turning repetition into a hypnotist's pendulum. Yet the most chilling technique isn't what's said, but what's omitted. The manuscript never directly accuses the prince of tyranny. It plants the idea by describing his father's reign as an age unburdened by suspicion, implying the son's rule is its dark opposite. It doesn't claim the new heir is saintly. It dwells on his monastic humility until readers assume virtue. This is persuasion by negative space, letting the audience connect dots that may not exist. Literary analysts compare it to a medieval version of show, don't tell except hear. The showing is a hall of mirrors designed to make viewers see what the writer needs them to. And then there's the humor. Buried beneath the gravitas are flashes of wit so dry, they're easy to miss. One passage praises the rival claimant's admirable restraint in never fathering bastards, a backhanded compliment that subtly highlights the prince's rumored indiscretions. Another describes the old king's council as men who debate the weight of feathers while the treasury burns. These aren't just jabs, they're psychological crowbars, prying open the reader's skepticism with laughter before sliding in the knife. The ghostwriter understood that mockery disarms faster than fury. What emerges from these linguistic autopsies isn't just a portrait of skill, but of obsession. The manuscript's precision, every alliteration placed, every biblical allusion cross-referenced, suggests someone who didn't just craft arguments but lived them. This wasn't a hired scribe tossing off propaganda. It was a mind that saw politics as the ultimate art form, where thrones were canvases and words were brushes dipped in poison. Today's spin doctors could spend lifetimes studying its techniques and still miss half its tricks, because the greatest masterpiece here wasn't the dynasty it toppled. It was the way it made the world believe the revolution had been their idea all along. The manuscript's legal legacy was like a slow-burning fuse, quietly smoldering through the centuries until it ignited revolutions no medieval scribe could have imagined. Buried in its footnotes and marginalia lay arguments so radical, they wouldn't find their full voice until the Enlightenment's pens took up the cause. Take the infamous Clause 17, a single sentence wedged between discussions of crop rotations. No man inherits wisdom with his father's lands, nor should he inherit power. At the time, it was dismissed as poetic flourish. But 300 years later, philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu would distill that very idea into treatises on governance, stripping away the scripture-laden phrasing to reveal a blueprint for meritocracy. What made these legal innovations so explosive was their disguise. The ghostwriter wrapped subversion in tradition, smuggling radical notions into familiar forms. One passage justifying the new king's rule cited an obscure Saxon law about the worthiest steed inheriting the stable. To medieval jurists, it sounded like dusty precedent. To future reformers, it became a rallying cry against hereditary privilege. Even the document's structure was revolutionary, its clauses numbered for easy reference, a novelty later adopted by constitutional drafters. The scribe didn't just argue for change, they engineered the tools to make it stick. Then there were the quiet rebellions in the details. The manuscript's treatment of women's inheritance rights, though couched in paternalistic language, contained loopholes wide enough to drive a carriage through. By emphasizing a ruler's duty to protect all heirs, not merely the swiftest, it inadvertently strengthened Dowager Queen's claims to regency, a shift that rippled through European courts for generations. Modern scholars still debate whether this was intentional or a happy accident. Either way, the ghostwriter proved that the most enduring revolutions aren't shouted from pulpits. they're tucked into subclauses until the world catches up. The real surprise, how these ideas outlasted the very dynasty they were meant to serve. When Napoleon's lawyers drafted the civil code, they lifted whole passages about capacity over lineage from forgotten commentaries tracing back to the manuscript. America's founding fathers, though they'd never admit it, echoed its arguments when rejecting primogeniture. Even today, when a court rules that leadership should be earned rather than inherited, the ghostwriter's ink stains the verdict. Their genius wasn't in crafting laws for their time. It was in planting acorns that would grow into forests no one saw coming. Perhaps the ultimate irony lies in how thoroughly the manuscript's legal DNA has been sanitized. Modern politicians quote its principles without knowing their source, assuming these ideas sprang fully formed from Enlightenment salons. But every time a society debates whether bloodline should dictate destiny, whether office should go to the most capable rather than the best connected, the ghostwriter's quill scratches again in the margins of history. Their words were never just about who sat on a medieval throne. They were about who gets to sit at any table, in any era, and why. That's the power of an idea wrapped in parchment. It can outlive kingdoms, outwit censors, and outargue time itself. Artistic depictions of the succession crisis tell us more about the censors than the history they tried to erase. Take the famed Ardennes tapestry, woven just 2 decades after the coronation. At first glance, it's a straightforward celebration of the new king's divine mandate. But look closer, the border scenes teem with odd details. A hooded figure handing a scroll to a monk, a scribe's empty stool by a guttering candle, even a shadowy hand adjusting the scales of justice from behind a drapery. These weren't accidents. They were quiet rebellions by artists forced to glorify the official story while smuggling traces of the truth into the margins. The weavers knew their patrons would focus on the central triumphant imagery, missing the subversion stitched in plain sight. The stage adaptations were even more brazen in their coded defiance. A popular 15th century morality play, The Gardener's Virtue, recast the crisis as an allegory about pruning a diseased rosebush, a clear nod to the manuscript's central metaphor. Though the ghostwriter's role was reduced to a nameless voice of reason, audiences would have recognized the telltale phrases lifted directly from the banned text. When the actor playing the gardener declared, "A steady hand knows no remorse," the line landed like a blade. The performance was allowed to continue, but records show the playwright spent a month in the stocks shortly after. Not for treason, mind you officially, his crime was public drunkenness. The real offense was making the crowd remember what they'd been ordered to forget. Opera composers proved the most cunning of all. In The Crown of Shadows, performed for the royal court in 1724, the ghostwriter appears as a bass-voiced spirit of counsel who materializes in a cloud of incense. His aria, a haunting melody about ink-stained hands that right-toppled thrones, was sung in Latin, ensuring most listeners missed the subtext. But the libretto's dedication page told another story. It bore an exact replica of the manuscript's lost opening lines, disguised as an epigraph from Virgil. The Duke who commissioned the piece was exiled within the year, though the official decree cited financial irregularities. Art, it seemed, could wear many masks, but the crown's spies always recognized the face beneath. What makes these sanitized retellings so fascinating isn't their inaccuracy, but their desperation. Every altered detail, every omitted scene, every conveniently rewritten character proved how terrified the establishment remained of the ghostwriter's legacy. A truly powerless idea wouldn't need constant policing. The very act of censorship became its own kind of tribute, admitting that a mere scribe's words still held more sway than the swords that tried to silence them. Even in distortion, the story survived not despite the edits, but because of them. Each bowdlerized version became a puzzle, inviting audiences to read between the lines and reconstruct the dangerous truth. After all, nothing makes people crave a secret like being told they can't know it. The ghostwriter would have appreciated the irony. Their masterpiece had achieved the rarest feat: it couldn't be destroyed because it had already dissolved into the culture itself. Like wine poured into a river, the manuscript's essence spread too far to ever be fully reclaimed. Every tapestry thread, every staged whisper, every operatic crescendo carried traces of its power. And in that diffusion lay its final victory. When ideas outrun their authors, they become immortal. The tactics of that medieval ghostwriter didn't vanish with parchment and quills. They evolved, slipping into the bloodstream of modern persuasion with chilling precision. Think of the leaked emails that sway elections, their cherry-picked phrases weaponized to confirm biases, or the viral manifestos that flood social feeds, their algorithms fine-tuned to exploit outrage the way the manuscript once exploited divine fear. Today's influencers might not crown kings, but they anoint trends, shape ideologies, and dismantle reputations with the same surgical efficiency as that shadowy scribe. The tools have upgraded from candlelit scriptoriums to backlit screens, but the playbook remains eerily familiar. Isolate insecurities, dress them in half-truths, and let the audience's imagination do the rest. Consider how modern political operatives reframe narratives by flooding zones with alternate realities. A candidate's gaffe isn't just a mistake, it's proof of a deeper flaw, just as the manuscript turned the prince's shaky hands into signs of divine disfavor. Viral threads don't argue, they insinuate, stacking concerned citizen testimonials and deceptively cropped clips until dissent seems irrational. Sound familiar? It's Clause 17's meritocracy argument repackaged as a hashtag, the rotten branch metaphor reborn as a meme about draining the swamp. The ghostwriter's genius was recognizing that persuasion isn't about facts, it's about framing. And in an age where attention spans are currency, framing is everything. Even corporate branding owes the manuscript a debt. Watch how companies spin crises into reinvention opportunities, their press releases dripping with the same faux inevitability that made the new king's rise seem preordained. A factory closure becomes pivoting to sustainability. A data breach accelerates our commitment to transparency. Like the ghostwriter's myrrh-scented ink, these phrases are designed to evoke subconscious associations, not with logic, but with emotion. The medieval scribe would nod in recognition at modern focus groups testing which slogan feels authentic enough to mask exploitation. But here's the twist. Today's shadow authors often don't even know they're following a centuries-old script. The consultant crafting a smear campaign, the marketer seeding organic influencer endorsements, the troll farm amplifying division, they're all heirs to that nameless scribe, weaponizing anonymity and ambiguity just as ruthlessly. The manuscript's real legacy isn't in any single throne it toppled, but in revealing how easily reality bends when stories are sharper than swords. Every time a lie goes unchallenged because it feels true, or a leader rises by echoing what audiences already half believe, the ghostwriter's ink stains another page. The parchment may have crumbled, but the playbook, it's on its millionth edition. Archaeological discoveries rarely arrive with answers, only sharper questions. The 2017 excavation near the ruins of the old Royal Library seemed routine until workers pried open a lead-lined box buried beneath centuries of rubble. Inside lay a set of quills, their tips still stained dark, nestled beside cracked ink pots and a slab of dried pigment. At first glance, they could have belonged to any scribe. But when chemists analyzed the residue, the results sent shockwaves through academic circles. The ink matched the manuscript's exact formulation, down to the trace amounts of myrrh and iron gall. Suddenly, the ghostwriter wasn't just a shadow in history, they'd left fingerprints. Debate erupted over what the toolkit revealed. Some scholars pointed to the box's burial site, arguing only a high-ranking scribe would have worked so close to the royal chambers. Others noted the absence of a desk or parchment scraps, suggesting the items were hidden in haste. The most tantalizing clue: one quill bore microscopic grooves consistent with left-handed writing, a rarity in an era that forced left-handed children to switch. Medieval records mention a disgraced court poet known for his sinister hand, exiled years before the succession crisis. Could this be his revenge, sealed in a box like a time capsule? But skeptics waved red flags. The ink match, while compelling, wasn't definitive. Dozens of scribes might have used the same recipe. The lead lining, usually reserved for preserving sacred texts, seemed oddly extravagant for a mere scribe's tools. And why bury them at all unless someone wanted them found? Conspiracy theorists whispered that the artifacts were planted centuries later, a royally sanctioned decoy to muddy the ghostwriter's trail. After all, the best way to hide a lie is to let others discover a more convenient truth. The artifacts did prove one thing beyond doubt: the manuscript was no abstract treatise. It was crafted with physical tools by human hands, hands that trembled or steadied as they plotted a kingdom's fate. Whether the box held the ghostwriter's quills or a rival's frame job, its very existence pulled the story off the page and into the dirt where history, no matter how carefully buried, never stays quiet. The ghostwriter's silence is a blank parchment, and every historian who touches it leaves smudges of their own making. Was this shadowy figure driven by vengeance? Imagine a scholar exiled from court, their life's work burned over some petty slight, now rewriting the rules of power from the margins. Or picture a minor noble, their family land seized by the crown, weaving legal arguments like tripwires to snare the very dynasty that ruined them. The manuscript's precision suggests intimate knowledge of royal weaknesses, too intimate for an outsider. Perhaps its author was once an insider, nursing a grudge with the patience of a spider spinning silk. But what if justice wasn't personal but philosophical? The text's obsession with merit over birthright hints at a mind steeped in radical thought. Maybe the ghostwriter was one of those rare medieval souls who genuinely believed rulers should earn their titles, not inherit them. Some scholars point to passages echoing the Cathar heresies, which denied earthly hierarchies as corruptions of divine will. If true, the manuscript wasn't just a power grab, it was a sermon in disguise, its author a reformer willing to risk the pyre to plant seeds of change. The irony: their ideals triumphed while their name vanished. Then there's the unsettling third possibility. The ghostwriter was neither wronged nor righteous but bored. Medieval courts bred geniuses with too much intellect and too little outlet. Think of chess masters forced to play checkers, their brilliance festering into mischief. The manuscript's layered wit, its delight in turning tradition against itself, smells of someone playing the ultimate prank, not for gold or glory, but to prove they could puppeteer a kingdom with nothing but paragraphs. The darkest punchline: they walked away unscathed, leaving others to live or die by their wordplay. Yet all these theories share one flaw: they assume the ghostwriter had a single motive. History's greatest manipulators rarely do. Maybe vengeance sparked the plot, ideology shaped the arguments, and sheer artistry sealed the execution. Or perhaps the truth lies in the gaps between these guesses, in some private calculus we'll never recover. What lingers isn't just the mystery of why they acted, but why they refused to take credit. In that refusal, they achieved something rarer than power. They became a mirror, reflecting back whatever we need to see: justice, madness, or the terrifying freedom of a mind unchained. History remembers the ghostwriter as a man because of course it does. In a world where power wore a beard, where chronicles spoke of kings and never queens, we assume the hand that reshaped a dynasty must have been male. But parchment doesn't reveal fingerprints, and ink carries no gender. What if the most brilliant political mind of the medieval age wasn't a monk or a disgraced scholar, but a woman the history books erased twice over? Consider the possibilities. A highborn lady, perhaps raised on Latin and law at her father's knee, only to watch her withered brothers inherit everything. She'd have known the court's secrets, the way bloodlines really worked behind closed doors, or an abbess versed in scripture and diplomacy, her convent a hub for whispered alliances. Medieval convents weren't just prisons of piety, they were nerve centers where women wielded soft power, dispensing favors, forging letters, and yes, maybe even drafting manifestos. The manuscript's mastery of canon law suddenly makes eerie sense. Who better to twist scripture into a weapon than someone taught to see its gaps? The clues are there if you know where to look. That recurring metaphor of the pruned branch, oddly floral for a culture that likened power to swords and shields. The way the text frames the new king's humility as virtue, not weakness, echoing how noblewomen were taught to navigate a man's world. Even the distribution method copies slipped into sewing baskets, passed along pilgrimage routes by nuns, hints at networks women uniquely controlled. Yet if the ghostwriter was female, her anonymity wasn't just practical, it was existential. A man might have risked exposure for glory. A woman would have known discovery meant burning, not mere beheading. No wonder the trail goes cold. No wonder later chroniclers, all men, forgot to mention the sharp-tongued countess who vanished into a convent the year the manuscript appeared. The ultimate insult, when historians today call the text ahead of its time, they're unwittingly praising the exact kind of mind their predecessors worked so hard to silence. Here's the bitter twist we'll likely never know. The same system that let a woman's words topple a throne made sure she'd never get the credit, but maybe that's the point. The ghostwriter's greatest trick wasn't vanishing, it was proving that in the end, the words matter more than the hand that held the quill. And that's a lesson that echoes far beyond parchment, into every era where voices rise from the margins to rewrite the world. The manuscript's success wasn't inevitable. It was a knife's-edge moment where history could have pivoted violently in another direction. Picture the old heir clinging to power, his paranoia hardening into tyranny as the whispers of the text dogged his every step. Without the ghostwriter's carefully orchestrated narrative to unify the realm, the kingdom might have fractured into warring factions, each noble house backing its own claimant with steel and fire. The southern coal barons, hungry for autonomy, could have seceded entirely. The northern bishoprics, divided over the prince's legitimacy, might have turned their cloisters into arsenals. And the peasant revolts, already simmering over bread prices, would have found no unifying figure to channel their rage, only chaos. Yet stability came at its own cost. The rival line's reign, though peaceful on the surface, was built on a foundation of manufactured truth. Laws were rewritten, dissent quietly erased, and inconvenient histories scraped from vellum until the kingdom's memory became as polished as the new king's crown. The ghostwriter's gamble preserved the realm from bloodshed, but it also enshrined a dangerous precedent. That power could be legitimized not by right, but by narrative. Future rulers would learn the wrong lesson, that truth was malleable, and legitimacy could be drafted in ink rather than earned through virtue. The very stability the manuscript created may have sown the seeds for later corruption, as clever courtiers realized they could manipulate perception without ever drawing a sword. Then there's the haunting question of what was lost. The old heir, for all his flaws, represented continuity, a living link to centuries of tradition. His downfall didn't just remove a man, it severed a thread stretching back generations. The rival's line, though competent, lacked the old dynasty's mystique. In time, this erosion of sacred authority would make the throne vulnerable to new challenges, as merchants and lesser nobles began to question why any single family should rule at all. The ghostwriter's words didn't just change kings, they subtly unraveled the divine right they claimed to uphold. Alternate histories whisper seductively from the margins. What if the prince had embraced the manuscript's critiques, reforming rather than resisting? What if the ghostwriter had aimed higher, not just replacing a monarch but dismantling hereditary rule entirely? The greatest cost of their victory may have been its modesty. By preserving the system while swapping its figurehead, they ensured the kingdom survived, but at the price of true transformation. The manuscript proved words could topple kings, yet left unasked the most radical question: why should there be kings at all? Some revolutions don't fail because they're crushed, but because they succeed just enough to stall the next greater upheaval. The ghostwriter's legacy, then, is a paradox, a triumph that saved a realm while freezing it in time, like a fly in amber, beautiful and unchanging, but no longer alive. The ghostwriter's legacy splits history down the middle like a well-aimed quill stroke. To some, they're a savior who traded one lie for 1,000 lives, sparing the realm the carnage of civil war. To others, they're the original spin doctor, proving that truth matters less than storytelling. But here's the uncomfortable question: does the difference between hero and villain hinge on the outcome or the method? Imagine a surgeon who saves a life with stolen tools. Does the theft tarnish the healing? The ghostwriter operated in those same shadows, mending a broken succession with borrowed authority and forged precedents. Their defenders argue that corrupt systems can't be dismantled politely, that sometimes the only way to break a chain is to pick its lock. Yet the cost of that lock-picking lingers. By framing their candidates' rise as divinely ordained rather than politically engineered, the ghostwriter didn't just replace a king, they poisoned the well of legitimacy for all who followed. Future rulers would learn to cloak ambition in scripture, hiring their own scribes to draft heavenly endorsements. The manuscript's real damage wasn't the lie it told, but the blueprint it left. Power could be laundered through narrative, and morality was just another rhetorical device. Modern parallels sting. Today's deepfakes and bot armies are just digital quills, scratching out realities as fluid as medieval parchment. But maybe the ghostwriter's true sin was humility. Had they stepped forward, claimed responsibility, and defended their deception as necessity, history might judge them differently. Instead, they vanished, leaving their words to bear the weight of both salvation and sin. In that silence, they became a Rorschach test for every generation. Revolutionaries hailed them as proof that pens outmatch swords. Traditionalists shudder at their subversion of order. And the rest of us, we're left tugging at the same knot. Is it worse to seize power unjustly or to let injustice keep its crown? The ghostwriter's ink never faded, it just seeped into the fabric of how we debate power itself. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that we'll never know if they acted from principle or pride. The manuscript reads like moral calculus weighing bloodshed against deceit. But what if its author simply enjoyed the game? Great manipulators throughout history share one trait: the thrill of making the world dance to their hidden tune. Whether that makes the ghostwriter a monster or a maestro depends on how much grace we grant to brilliance unbound by scruples. Their story forces us to confront the oldest question of all. Does the end justify the means, or do the means corrupt every end they touch? The parchment's gone, but the debate it sparked remains eternal. The rivals' descendants wore their crowns with practiced ease, their portraits lining palace halls in gilded frames, their chronicles meticulously scrubbed of any mention of ink-stained hands that had placed them there. For 300 years, their dynasty ruled, each generation inheriting not just lands and titles, but the unspoken lesson etched between the lines of their ancestors' rise. Power belongs to those who script their own legitimacy. Court historians wrote of divine favor, of battlefield victories, of wise counsels, never of the fragile parchment that had made it all possible. The ghostwriter's name didn't just fade from memory, it was chiseled away like a mason smoothing over a crack in the foundation. Yet the manuscript's absence from official records didn't diminish its influence, it magnified it. Future kings learned to wield narrative like a scepter, employing armies of scribes to draft proclamations that sounded like prophecy. When rebellion stirred, they didn't just send soldiers, they flooded towns with pamphlets painting dissent as heresy. When drought struck, their poets spun tales of sacrificial kings weathering heaven's tests. The ghostwriter's real legacy wasn't in the words they left behind, but in the precedent they set. Truth could be drafted, edited, and bound like any other royal decree. Modern rulers still play the same game, though the tools have evolved. Press secretaries now craft statements with the same calculated ambiguity as medieval scribes, turning scandals into learning opportunities and failures into strategic pivots. Speechwriters borrow the old tricks, threading applause lines with subconscious cues, a president's folksy anecdote about hardship, a CEO carefully leaked personal email. Even social media managers are heirs to the ghostwriter's craft, curating feeds to frame reality like a tapestry with all the messy threads tucked out of sight. The uncomfortable truth: we're all complicit in this alchemy. Every time we share a headline without checking its source, every time we dismiss facts that clash with our chosen narrative, we become scribes in training. The manuscript didn't just teach kings how to rule, it taught subjects how to be ruled. Its most insidious lesson was that consent isn't just manufactured, it's collaborative. We polish the illusions handed to us, adding our own strokes until the forgery feels authentic. Perhaps that's why the ghostwriter's anonymity feels so unsettling. They proved that the most powerful ideas aren't the ones shouted from rooftops, but the ones we whisper to ourselves, believing we thought them first. The manuscript's real triumph wasn't changing who sat on the throne, it was changing how all of us see the throne itself. And that's a spell no amount of historical revisionism can break. Centuries later, the manuscript's lesson endures. Power isn't just taken, it's written. The ghostwriter's quill didn't just scribble words, it etched a blueprint for influence that still shapes our world. Think about the last viral headline that changed your mind, the political speech that made you nod without questioning, or even the ad that convinced you to buy something you didn't need. These aren't accidents, they're descendants of that medieval manuscript, proof that persuasion is an art as old as ink itself. The quietest voices often shout the loudest across time, not because they're the truest, but because they're the cleverest. The ghostwriter's real genius was understanding that history isn't a monolith, it's clay. Every era rewrites its past to suit its present, scrubbing away inconvenient truths like stains on parchment. Today's politicians reframe defeats as strategic retreats, corporations rebrand scandals as growth opportunities, and even social media feeds curate reality to fit our biases. We're all living in the ghostwriter's world now, where narratives are battlegrounds and attention is the ultimate currency. The manuscript didn't just alter a succession, it exposed a timeless truth. Those who control the story control the stakes. But here's the twist. The ghostwriter's anonymity forces us to confront our own role in this dance. Every time we share a post without fact-checking, every time we accept a catchy slogan as truth, we become scribes in someone else's script. The manuscript's real legacy isn't in the throne it toppled, but in the mirror it holds up to us. Who's writing your world's story? Is it you, or algorithms, spin doctors, or influencers who have mastered the medieval art of framing reality? The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we disbelieve, but the ones we swallow without tasting, and that's the haunting beauty of this tale. It's not just about a long-dead scribe or a dusty parchment. It's about the stories we live by, often without realizing they're stories at all. The ghostwriter whispers to us across the ages. Question the narratives that feel too convenient, the truths that arrive pre-packaged, the histories that never quite add up. Because somewhere, right now, another manuscript is being drafted, not on vellum, but in pixels and sound bites, and its words might just shape the next throne, the next revolution, or even your next thought. So as you close this video, don't just marvel at the past, lean in, listen for the scratch of pens in the shadows, and remember, the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted from rooftops, but the ones we tell ourselves when no one's watching. If this tale gripped you, imagine what other secrets lie buried in ink, waiting to rewrite the world. Subscribe now, because history isn't just something we study. It's something we make, one word at a time.